For those of you that are listening on iTunes, I'm talking about some things that are important to actually be able to see. It's really tricky to describe the intersection of these joints. So go to chairmakers.com and watch the actual video when you get a chance, and it'll be easier to understand what I'm talking about. So welcome back to another Ask Brian Boggs show. This week's focus is on joinery, and we've actually got some really good questions in. So I do want to ask you seriously one more time, if you would please leave a review if you're listening on iTunes. It really will help us kind of get a sense of how you're enjoying the show and what we might do. We've transcribed all the episodes up to this one, and they're public. Each question has been transcribed, and it's in a blog post on chairmakers.com. So this might make it easier for you to use this information and refer to it, find things that you remember were spoken about but don't remember quite what was said. So you can subscribe on YouTube, iTunes for future episodes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Chairmakers. And if you have any questions you'd like answered, you can, on the show, go to chairmakers.com or Instagram at Brian Boggs Chairmakers, YouTube, the comment section on our YouTube channel, or Twitter at Chairmakers. So lots of ways to reach out there, and we have really enjoyed the questions and appreciate each one because it really opens up an opportunity to talk more in depth even than the question really directs. And the first one I want to talk about was Mark Barabbas's question. I hope I pronounced that right, Mark. Thanks for sending this in. I cut my mortise and tenon joints so that they can be assembled by hand pressure, and they fall apart, and they don't fall apart from the force of gravity. I presume that means you're holding them up so the tenon would fall out. Many times I find that if I wait a few days prior to assembly, the joint loosens up so that it no longer holds together. My guess is that even though the wood is kiln dried, the new exposed wood lost a bit of moisture, which caused it to shrink some. After applying PVA adhesive, the parts swell back up and the parts fit together firmly again. The question is, will a joint displaying this behavior likely to be problematic in the long run? The short answer is absolutely it will. There are a lot of things that have to be working right in order for a joint to work. What you're doing is trying to ultimately integrate the strength of one part into the strength of another, and have the least amount of strength loss in that transition. You can't do that mechanically with a mortise and tenon joint alone without a good glue bond. Because, as you said, you can put that in with hand pressure. That means you can pull it out with hand pressure. That's just not enough to hold a piece of furniture together. You've got to have a glue bond. What's important in order to get a glue bond is that you've put enough wood, or ideally as much wood as will work, in that mortise in the form of a tenon. The more wood you can get in that mortise for its size, the stronger the joint you're going to have, provided that you're getting a good glue bond. So there's two problems I'm seeing with what's going on. One is that it appears that the wood isn't dry. Kiln dried, it does not mean the wood doesn't have moisture in it. It just means that somebody sent the wood through a process that allows them to charge you more money for that wood than green wood. I have been buying wood from suppliers around the country and across the state, and I have not found a single supplier yet who has failed to send me wood that does not need further drying. Now, they will sometimes send dry wood, but they will sometimes send wet wood. It's up to me as a consumer to pay attention to what I'm buying and put a meter on it before I'm buying it if I have the opportunity, or at least order it soon enough so that I can meter it when it comes in and I have enough time to finish drying it. That's kind of a problem in our industry, and we can't fix the industry, but we certainly can fix our process. So a moisture meter, a good electronic moisture meter, I use a Wagner. It's an old pinless Wagner. We'll talk about moisture meters on another show. But getting that moisture down to at least as low as 8%, if not lower, for assembling interior furniture is really important. It doesn't matter how perfectly you fit that joint. It doesn't matter how strong the wood is, and it doesn't matter what kind of glue you use. Well, actually, it does matter what kind of glue you use, but all of those things have to work for you in order to get a joint that's going to work over time. So what's probably happening is the wood just wasn't dry, but what can also happen is you can put a meter on the surface of an 8/4 board and get a very low reading. Once you cut that open, meter the inside and check again to make sure that the reading on the outside and the inside are both dry enough to do whatever you're going to do with it. Whatever, we make furniture sometimes that doesn't require bone dry wood like that. I'll get that in because there's another question I want to get into. But moisture content is as critical as anything else. Rex Bostrom writes in, is burl wood acceptable for chair seats and backs? And if so, are there any special techniques that should be used with burl wood? Obviously, it will vary from tree to tree and species to species, and shouldn't be used and should be without cracks or inclusions. Well, that's for sure true. Rex, I would recommend checking out Bob Erickson's site at ericksonwoodworking.com. Bob and Tor are doing some beautiful chairs there. Bob's a friend of mine from over the decades, and he's a master chair maker and does really nice work, and he's one of the few that I know that'll dare to use burls. I would not recommend burls for someone just starting into chair making. There's just too many judgment calls you have to make about the integrity of the specific blank that you're considering using. So in general, I would try to avoid it. When you get to the point of mastery and you feel confident that you can make a really good assessment as to the soundness of a specific burl, then the fact that it is a burl is not going to destroy your chair. There's just a lot more judgment that comes into play when you're using something as cantankerous and potentially unpredictable as a burl. It's just you've got to really be on your toes. And so what you're doing by introducing a burl is not necessarily causing failure, but you're certainly increasing, exponentially the ways in which your furniture can fail. It's not necessarily going to cause failure, but it's just brings in a whole other bag of worms that I'm mixing metaphors. Can of worms that you don't necessarily want to be dealing with unless you're a real crackerjack chair maker. And Bob certainly wanted. I would recommend to everybody just go check out his site. They're doing some really cool stuff. G. Pennington Windsor Chairs writes in, hey Brian, at Rundell and I were discussing in our class recently how tight the 5/8 mortise and tenon for Windsor and ladderback chairs should be after super drying the tenon and using hide glue. Your thoughts? Well, the language used in fitting joints is often similar to the first question I got in from Mark Barabbas, how tight it should feel. And truth be told, until you're putting numbers on it, it's really hard to have a valuable conversation. So what I've done is over the years is just gotten used to using a dial caliper, and I have toyed with different tightnesses of mortises. Early on in my career, I was told by several master chair makers that 10/1000ths oversized for a tenon, in other words, a tenon being 10/1000ths larger than the hole, is a really good size for a greenwood joint. And I've kept that in my greenwood chairs. In fact, I've got one here. This chair is about, Melanie, what is this, 6 or 7 years old? Yeah. And this guy is as tight in its joints as it was the day I made it, and there is no glue at all. It's just using differential movement, super dry hickory for rungs, and fairly damp, about 15 to 18% legwood, and that would be soft maple. That moisture content is enough to hold the chair together, and that oversizing wasn't so much that I weakened the leg or cracked the leg. But it's important to consider which woods you're using. If I'm going with a high glue joint, which I do in my 3-slat ladder back chairs, if I'm going to make them out of walnut or cherry or even hickory, where I'm not getting the advantage of the characteristic of hickory and the characteristic of maple marrying together inside that joint through a lot of movement, if I need a high glue, or if I need a glue bond and I want to use high glue, I would not oversize the tenon at all. There's no advantage in that whatsoever. I would make the tenon as close to a perfectly sized fit. In other words, it would ultimately be about 0.02 of an inch smaller than the hole. So you would be able to push it in there. It would feel snug, but you should be able to bottom it out. And when you pull it out, it should pop like a cork. That's extreme, but a good chair maker can do that. And it's best, I've found that I can get a good feel fit with just turning it using a bidan tool and a wrench to size it with. But I prefer to turn it about 0.04 oversized and then sand it really quickly to even the surface so that I have more fibers of the tenon in contact with the fibers of the leg. And that contact is actually just, it's actually the wrong term, because they can't contact if there's a glue body there and the tenon is smaller than the mortise. You've got about 1/1000 of an inch thick layer of high glue in between, and then the rung's going to swell pretty quickly and get super tight in there. As long as your rung is around 4% moisture content and the hole is not drier than that, which is going to be nearly impossible, then that should be fine. The rung's going to swell up, fill that hole, and be tight, and it should be tight for as long as the piece is taken care of. Those are hard dimensions to hit, particularly in the environment in which Windsor and other post and rung chairs are made. What attracts a lot of people to that kind of chair making is how primitive the approach can be and still get a successful chair. And I think the Greenwood chair making is, whether it's Windsor or post and rung like the one I just showed you, is a very forgiving, much more forgiving than when you're trying to get an actual strong glue joint. Because if you're using soft maple for the legs and hickory for the tenon part, or soft maple for the whatever is housing the mortise, and hickory for the tenon, you're going to get a malleability in that joint that will absorb a little bit of oversizing without destroying the leg or the mortise part. So there are a lot of variables that impact that, but ultimately the perfect high glue joint is a super dry tenon, not super dry mortise, and about a 0.02 undersizing. That's going to feel a little loose with high glue on there. It's just going to slide right in because it's lubricated, but it will bond very, very well. From Prusa Woodworks, do you have space at the bottom of your mortise for extra glue? Well, usually, if it's a shouldered mortise and tenon, I do leave space at the bottom of the mortise for glue, just because otherwise the glue tends to push the tenon out, or the pressure of compressed glue at the bottom of the mortise will tend to push the joint back apart. In fact, even though we do leave glue, a well, what I call a glue well, it's about 1/8 of an inch at the bottom. We were just putting a set of outdoor chairs together yesterday, and we had clamped it together, and as soon as I backed the clamp off a little bit, the hydraulic pressure inside pushed that tenon back out, and that's because the epoxy that we're using in that joint for our outdoor chairs acted both as a lubricant to allow the mortise to move in and out freely, but also created an air seal, so that the pressure of assembly created an air pocket at the bottom. So having a little bit of a pocket there for glue actually helps mitigate that somewhat. I don't know that it's absolutely essential, but for sure you want to make sure that you've got at least as long or as deep a tenon as you have, as deep a mortise as you have a tenon. You never want to bottom out unless the shoulder is what's bottoming out. So that was a good one. Then from JMA Woodworks, JMAW Works, I guess that's JMA Woodworks. Can you talk more about your tapered tenon universal joint, how you arrived at it, and broadly how you make both parts, and what application it might have in a home shop? That's a big one, and I'm glad you wrote this in ahead of time because I had time to think about it, and I almost decided to just dedicate an entire show to that because it just does open a lot, and we may still do that at another time. The double tenons have been around for centuries. The Japanese even have, I saw Toshio Date one time demonstrating with a double chisel. It was a two-pronged chisel for chopping double tenons. So I know that idea is not new. The idea of a tapered joint is not new because Windsor chair makers have been tapering their seats as they go into, tapering the top of the legs as they go into the seats for centuries. What is new, I think, I just haven't seen anyone using tapered tenons like these. These two tenons, each, I don't know if you can see it there, the tenons actually taper 3 degrees so that they, over their 1 1.25 inch length, they taper 1/8 of an inch. And that's just done with standard mortising and tenoning techniques, but using a custom bit with a 3-degree taper. Whether that's practical in a shop has more to do with the attitude of the person running the shop. I would sooner have a tapered bit and a really good mortising and tenoning system and sell the table saw, tune up the bandsaw, and use bandsaw and router for getting things done. But after experimenting with this for years, the value of being able to efficiently cut a very precise tenon that comes together right off the machine is worth a lot. Not only does it save time in being able to build really fine furniture, because you're not having to hand shape or hand dress the piece, but the assembly doesn't require touch-up. Things just come together perfectly. That's the ability to do that will drive your design thinking, and that's even more important than the efficiency of getting the piece done. Is our joint making capabilities have been what drive our design concepts since we started thinking about making furniture. And when I say we, I mean the human species, not just those who are paying attention to this show. So practical in a shop, well, FMT jig and other, the multi-router systems, all of those are capable of cutting an accurate tenon. Being able to cut an accurate tenon with a taper is just a matter of having a custom bit made. We can talk about that later, and I'll probably post on I will do that. I'll make a commitment to post on chairmakers.com what the source that we get these bits from. They are expensive. If you're going to buy one or two, I think there's something like $250 a piece. If we get enough people wanting to do a group order, I can organize that. We need to order some as well, and they're going to be a lot less. So if there's a bunch of you interested, send us a note and we'll follow up on that and see what we can work out. But I do think it's totally practical in a home shop, but it means being willing to think a little bit differently and think about things that have a slightly more complex relationship. And what I have found is that woodworkers, for the most part, try very hard to avoid that, feeling that woodworking and chair making is complex enough without adding what seems like a complex joint. But once it's mastered, employees of ours who haven't been here very long are able to cut mortise and tenons like this on our system that are absolutely within tolerance. The other thing about the taper joint, and I've got another one here. This is one that we do on the outdoor chair. This one has a housed shoulder. In other words, the shoulder here is below the surface of the part. What that does is it allows us to have this curve be continuous without having the curve interrupted by a flat spot here where the shoulder would ordinarily land. The whole piece goes subsurface. So here's the part. This leg was cut, we've been kicking this around for how many years in the shop? Six years ago. This was cut on our overarm router. This was cut last week. And there is a 10/1000 taper on each tenon. So the tenon drops in nice and easily. And I can't, right here, I cannot push it all the way in. If I bear hug it, I might, no, it's going to take a clamp to finish that up. So these tenons are actually, when buried, slightly larger than the hole. Their seam is, I don't know if you can see that very well, but that seam is absolutely airtight. These joints were cut a year apart, and I just went down, 7 years apart. And I just went down and grabbed these parts and put them together. Now, one thing that means is that when this was cut, it was probably the same moisture content that it is now, even though it has certainly would have fluctuated up and down between now and then. But the benefit, one of the many benefits of being able to do a housed shoulder mortise and tenon, so that the thickness of this part is the same as the total thick width of this joint. So this whole part is going into this leg, but it allows a seamless joint where you would otherwise have a problematic mating of shoulders. Because the tenons are flush to the outside here, it means it's like having this part with two legs instead of one. It's going to be a lot more stable, a lot more resistance to torque and rack. It's about as strong a joint as you can get for these two pieces. The other thing is, especially in this part of the joint, I don't know if you can see that very well, but right here there's a little shoulder, a little shelf essentially. So this is where the front leg comes in. It's exactly the same size joint, so this is going to fit in there just right. But because that shoulder, now this mortise is actually a three-way compound, fully housed double taper locking tenon. That might not be practical in the home shop because you can't do that with a plunge router. I think you have to have an overarm router to do that. And the joint requires a tricky setup. But the advantage is that with this shelf here, the weight of the person sitting is borne by the entire rail, not just its tenon, as typically they would be in most chairs. So there's advantages there. Another advantage in the taper locking joint is that it actually is more forgiving dimensionally. Now these were basically a perfect fit. I don't think we can do better than that. But these tenons can actually be 3/1000s, maybe 4/1000s larger than the hole itself, because they start off 10,000, well, they would still start off 6/1000ths of an inch smaller than the hole, and they would be halfway in before they started getting very tight. With that much surface contact, they don't tend to split the mortise, plus they're already deep enough that they're not going to shear all the glue down to the bottom of the hole as it would if it were a straight mortise and tenon. That's even more true on this one, because this one drops in to its mortise almost all the way home, just dropping in, and so it's trapped all that glue between the tenon cheek and the mortise wall. Now there's about a 1/16 of an inch gap that you probably can see here. I can't push that any deeper. But at a 3-degree taper, a 1/16 of an inch gap means that the tenon is actually 6/1000ths larger than the mortise itself. But with that taper and the fact that it's this deep in there before it gets tight, we can press this in here and it will lock as it goes in. In other words, as soon as it bottoms out, you can't take it out. Without glue, you can beat it out with a hammer, but you certainly can't pull it out by hand. With glue, what happens is it presses that glue to such a thin wall that it will seize up pretty much immediately. That means when you get it home, you can pretty much release the clamps within a couple of minutes. So it's a tricky joint to learn and set up for, but once you get the hang of it, it's an amazing joint to work with. And here's another thing about it. we do tests a lot with these joints, and this was a chair that I didn't like the way these shoulders came through here. This glue joint here was just, the glue line was really fat, and now that it's seen several seasons.
Show that glue line.
Can you see that thick glue line there? It's probably, it's probably 10 thousandths of an inch thick. So when this came together, it didn't come up like it should have. And now that I look at this, I can see that it did not bond. The glue isn't going to bond if you don't pull it up tighter than that, unless it's epoxy. So we kicked this one, rejected this one, and decided to use it as a test. And so what we did is we put it in the bench vise and put one dog at this end and one dog at that end, and then just squeezed. And this leg flexed, or these two flexed closer together by 1.5 inches before the leg finally broke. And you can see that's not short grain, that's long grain. But this leg broke, the joint here never did move. And even after that test and a few years later, it still looks fine. Other than the fact that the shoulder did not bond. I mean, that's not a, you do get some strength from the shoulder seat and a seal and a bond there, and I want to get that because the joint will look better over time. But this was yellow glue or PVA glue. We have used high glue for that, but with this joint, there's basically no advantage in high glue. This is really not a fixable joint. I mean, if you've got high glue bond in there, and for some reason, I don't know how it would fail, but should it fail down the road, you're not going to be able to get steam into that joint all the way around all of those surfaces and have it come loose. So high glue is just not worth the trouble. So we use the quick stuff. So that was a long answer to a really good question. I appreciate the bringing that up, and we'll get more into that another time. So from Hidden Quarry Artisans, Brian, I've enjoyed the show. I have a finishing question. Well, let's look at that on a different show. We're going to get into finishes another time. This was about getting a richer finish underneath the, well, we've got 7 minutes though.
Yeah.
Or there's another one.
No, I think, oh, there's that one that, does a mortise chisel make a difference? Well, you left me some room to interpret what you were asking about, so I will. I started out mortising or chiseling all of my mortising all my chisels. I don't think I did that. But, you know, I reached a point, I guess, it was, well, I know I mortised for 8 years before I got a router. And there was my peak day of mortising, I cut 90 mortises in one day, which I don't recommend. That's a backache. So I'm real familiar with chopping mortises, and I felt like I got pretty good at it. But in the process of making things, to get a piece of furniture done in an amount of time where you've created a good value for the time you've put in it, I just don't think mortise chisels are the answer to practicality. There's another reason to use them, and that is just for the pleasure of learning something that we don't do anymore. Using a mortise chisel is really more about discipline, about practice, and about the pleasure of developing hand-eye coordination and precision through your body. It has almost nothing to do with the practicality of chairs or woodworking. I just don't see where it fits. You know, I was cutting a mortise in 5 minutes that seemed to me to be a good, solid mortise. But I never chopped a mortise that's anywhere close to the precision or consistency of what I get now with routers. And because, you know, there's no visible gain, unless somehow there's a spiritual gain in the process for the individual, not for the end user, I would much rather put my money into improving design and whole process than pounding away at a chisel. And by the way, mortising is very loud. I remember being in a room of full of students of mine who were mortising away, and I wanted the hearing protection. It's almost as bad as routers. But the type of mortise chisel you use, of course, makes a huge difference, but it has more to do with technique. In fact, my first chair, I literally chopped the mortises with a sharp screwdriver. I did not have a mortising chisel. I wanted to get the chair done. I didn't have the money for a chisel. The second chair, I used a cheap hardware store chisel, and it was somewhat better than a screwdriver, not a whole lot. And after that, I started using a pretty good Marples chisel. It was actually a mortising chisel, and that was a whole lot better than any of the prior efforts. And I wanted to really understand what the difference was and why the chisel was working so much better than the other tools, the hardware store chisel and of course the screwdriver. And when I looked at that chisel really carefully, and I could see that it was a lot more square in the way that it was tuned and sharpened. And so I went back and tuned and sharpened the hardware store chisel just as well as the Marples was. And it chopped a mortise with it, and I was amazed. It didn't seem to give me a worse mortise. And I thought, well, what the heck? Let's take a look at that screwdriver. And I went back and sharpened that screwdriver a little bit better and made it just as square and sharp and true as the chisel. And what do you know? I was able to chop a really good mortise with that sharp screwdriver. My point isn't that you don't need a good chisel and that you should throw your chisel away and get a screwdriver instead. But it's really more about the craftsman and how well you tune and are attentive to the chisel and what it's doing than what chisel you're using. And that, I think, is true for any tool in the shop. And, you know, being mostly broke all the time, I've always kind of been forced to get the most out of every tool I've got and tune it up and wait on getting that better, bigger machine. And it's paid off because now we get a lot done on some pretty simple tools. Looks like one more question has come in.
This is from David. What is your process for verifying a new construction method? Accelerated exposure, stress test, check multiple lumber types?
That's a really good question and a very important one. How do I know, or what's my process for moving into new joinery types and new ways of making things, construction techniques? Well, I've done a lot of different things over 35 years, and so I already have a good sense of what is and isn't practical. And I can usually look at a joint and tell whether or not I'm going to be able to get enough strength from it, but I then test it. And usually, at least in the last 10 years or so, the ideas that I've come up with have usually been better than prior ones. And I, get more information from those experiments. But, like I showed you with this, this is one I kept because it's kind of dramatic. Some of the others are less dramatic, or a lot of the others just got lost in the shop cleanups. But testing doesn't just tell you whether or not one particular joint or idea is going to work. It feeds your sense of wood's integrity and the integrity of what works and doesn't. And so having done a lot of testing over the years, just developed a pretty good sense of what will and won't work, and I don't have to go through too many failures to find out that something's going to be a good joint. Well, I'll wrap it up with that. Thanks y'all for listening in, and go check out the website, chairmakers.com, and look at our past episodes if you missed one. And please send us a review on iTunes. Would love to hear from you guys. And if you don't want to make it an official review, let us know what you think of the show. Appreciate it. Thanks.